Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide. So, my friend Yasmin's laptop stopped turning on a little over a week ago. It's not getting any power whatsoever, so I offered to take a look at it. I did some research online and it looks like this is a relatively common issue with this particular model of laptop. I don't think it's the battery. If the issue was that the battery was not holding a charge, then the laptop itself should still be able to get power when it's directly plugged into a wall outlet. Typically, manufacturers only use one or two, maybe three different kinds of screws. For the most part, it's usually just two different varieties, one for external screws, one for internal screws, so I think we should be good with just two trays here. I like to organize them so I don't lose things. So there's a total of 10 screws that we're going to have to remove to get to the inside of the laptop. I recommend using a screwdriver that is magnetic. That really helps, especially when working with tiny screws like this, because they're easy to get lost. Now that the screws are out, we can get to the inside of this. Sometimes that's easier said than done. Normally they're on here pretty tight, so we're gonna have to crack a corner open and then go from there. Best place to start is usually at the top by the hinge for the monitor. That's usually where you can get a corner and pry it open. I try to use my screwdriver to get a little wedge in there. And now that we've got one corner popped, should be able to get the whole thing off pretty easily. Alright guys, now we're on the inside of the laptop. So we've got a lot of components here. We've got the battery, which takes up the bulk of the space. It's this big black thing here, and there's a couple screws that we're going to have to pop off to get this battery out. So I'm going to start with the battery. Yeah, I was right. It looks like there are only two different kinds of screws. The black ones that are the longer ones to keep the chassis intact, and then the smaller ones for the internal components. So there are some wires here there's some ribbon cables and some power connectors to the main motherboard that are connected to a lot of these components. So you have to be careful when you're unscrewing them that you don't just yank the part out after you get the screws out. You also have to undo the cabling as well. Alright, so we're taking the battery out, and there's a cable here on the right, although it doesn't look like it's attached directly to the battery. So this main set of cables here, it looks like that's what's connecting the battery to the motherboard. So we're going to pry that out. And right there is the Wi-Fi antenna. It's at the top right corner. But first we're going to take the hard drive out. Now this is a hard drive. I can't tell if it's a solid state drive yet or if it's a mechanical drive. We just have to undo a couple screws here. Looks like it's got some magnetic shielding on the top of it. That's what that piece of, I don't know, aluminum is. So I'm going to put the internal screws on the right here. I'm going to put the internal screws on the bottom. So this hard drive connects through a SATA interface. So you just pop it off and it comes right out. Looks like it is a solid state drive, although it's from a company I've not heard of before. So now the battery and the SSD are removed. I think the next thing we're going to take out is probably, so we need to remove the motherboard, which is that big blue board. There's some ribbons here that connect that to various buttons on the side of the laptop. So we have to disconnect all of these cables. Okay, so we're going to start by taking out the screws on the motherboard, but there are a few of them. You can see there are some here and here and here. So it looks like about 4 or 5 total there, and then one on the left. So I'm going to start taking those out. And again, these are all the same kind of screws, so you can just throw them all in the bottom tray there, and they're interchangeable. So again, guys, we're replacing the motherboard, which is the big blue board that takes up the top upper right-hand side. So this is the wireless. That's the wireless antenna. So that's what provides Wi-Fi access to the laptop. So we're going to need to take that off because it is attached to the motherboard. Anything that's attached to the motherboard, we're going to have to pop out. So I'm going to unscrew the fan right now. So you can see that there's a big fan, and connected to that fan is basically a heat sink that dissipates heat from the CPU and GPU. So this is the fan, and this is the heat. It's like a block of metal, and there's some fins at the end of it that connect to the fan. So you can see there's thermal paste that is on top of the CPU die, which is then connected to the heat dissipation plate on the top of that. That helps absorb any heat between the chip and the metal plate, and then it transfers to the back of the laptop where the fan blows that hot air out of the back of the laptop. So we're going to go ahead and pop the fan off now. And there's some wires underneath here that you have to make sure that you get. And then there's a tiny, tiny little power cable. It's hard to see, but this tiny little power cable is what powers the fan. So we've popped that out. Now we can take the fan out. Okay, now we're going to remove some of the ribbon cables on the side of the unit, but first I want to see, looks like we've got a little power cable on the right here, and then we're also going to we're going to remove the wireless antenna here. Now the wireless antenna is connected to the motherboard, but only through its main interface port. The actual cabling for the antenna is not connected to the motherboard, so we don't have to undo the cables, we just have to kind of move this aside to the back. And now that that's removed, we just need to disconnect all of the ribbon cables on the side of the motherboard. I think this one actually attaches from the top instead of through the side. So those, if you just pull it up all the way, it just pops right out. First, we're going to undo these cables. And then this last one actually comes out from the top. These little strings, you pull upwards and it pops out. So we're going to apply some pressure upwards, and then it'll come right out. Okay guys, now we've got the main board completely removed from the laptop, and this is the board that we're going to be replacing. So this is the replacement board on the right. You can see that the CPU die does not have any thermal paste on it. So we're going to have to apply some thermal paste, and I already have some. I always keep some on hand. So first we need to seat this back into the laptop chassis. So I'm just going to realign it to the screws on the board and then pop it back into place. Okay, first I'm going to reconnect the Wi-Fi adapter back into the motherboard. And now that that's firmly back in place, I'm going to reconnect some of these ribbon cables. There's a black little piece of plastic at the top that snaps down to get them back on. And we just push this down and it snaps it into place. Next, I'm going to reconnect all these little power plugs, and these little tiny ones here, they power things like such as this one doesn't have a disk drive, but if it did, that sort of thing, like buttons on the outside, power buttons, that sort of thing. Alright, this guy snaps from the top down, so we're going to plug that in. And then we're going to reconnect the little guiding straps that you use to pull it out.
That's what she said!
Michael, please.
Next, I'm going to put the heatsink back on the CPU, but you'll notice that although there's still some thermal paste on the heatsink, there's no thermal paste on the actual CPU die, which is that big green chip in the top of the center. I have some thermal paste here, so I'm going to apply some of this on the CPU die, because without this, the CPU will likely overheat. You don't need a lot. I put like a little dollop on each main die. So this has an integrated graphics chipset and then the main CPU module. So I put a little drop of it on each, and that should be more than enough. Again, the heatsink itself still has some on there, so once I press it down, it'll spread, and it should be more than enough. Alright, so I'm going to put this back on the CPU, and that's going to, once I push down, the little dollop of thermal paste that I applied will spread over the top of the entire CPU. And then we're just going to screw this guy back into place. Alright, next we're gonna reattach the main fan. Well, in this case it's the only fan that this laptop has, so we're gonna put this back. And the front flap goes right underneath of the main heatsink channel. You have to lift that up a little bit and then reinsert it, because when it blows air, it pushes it out of the back there, so that little flap needs to be underneath the metal portion. Otherwise, it would blow it back into the case. So we're just going to screw this guy back down, get it nice and secure. And we're also going to plug that little black cable back in, because that's what actually gives it power. A lot of people miss that. You have to be careful because it's so tiny. Alright guys, next we're going to reinsert the SSD drive. And again, this connects through a SATA interface, so it's super simple. It literally just slides and locks back into place. And then we just replace the screws. So the next thing we're going to have to do is take the RAM from the old motherboard, which is right here, and move it to the new one. For some reason it's got this, it's like a metal enclosure, which I've never seen before in a laptop, but I guess it's for heat dissipation. So we're just going to pop this out. This is the old motherboard. And we're going to take this RAM, it's 8 gigabytes, and we're going to move it to the new motherboard. And it just snaps right into place. We just have to take off that magnetic shield and then snap it in, and then we're good to go. The next step is putting the battery back into place. I like to finish where I start. I think it makes the most sense methodically. There's also a cable here that you don't want to forget to reconnect. That's the cable that connects the battery to the motherboard. So again, this is the old motherboard, and we're gonna set that aside for now. Guys, now that we're done with everything, we're just gonna put the plastic back on. And then get everything screwed and back into place. Now, I can't actually test to see whether or not this worked because she forgot to give me the power cable to the laptop, so I don't have a way to give it power to make sure that it, you know, this investment of hers worked. But fingers crossed, man, because I really don't want her to have to buy a new laptop. That shit's expensive. Anyways, that's how you swap a motherboard on a Lenovo Idea Pad 320S. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. If you don't, give it a dislike. Leave me any comments if you have any questions below. Thank you for watching. Very much appreciated.